Good morning, everyone. Glad you're with us. This is my good friend Josh. Josh just works for Rest Ministries here in the Seattle region. This kind of kicked off with just a fantastic conversation. I hope it was a good conversation for you. I had a great time. We had a wonderful conversation just dreaming about the nature of outreach, how we want Advent to engage with the world around us, how we want to inhabit the commands of Jesus, the Great Commission, how to love our neighbors or self. And so this is an exploratory seminar just to find out more about Rest, to dream about ways we could potentially partner with this ministry, and I'm sure some of you are familiar with it already. So Josh, why don't I just open this up in a word of prayer, and thank you for your preparation and for giving us a vision of what the Lord has called you to. So Heavenly Father, I thank you for your servant Josh. From the first day I met him, I just was so impressed by the depth of his character, the wisdom that he just naturally resided in, and his clear love for you and for people. So thank you for his willingness to give us a vision of Rest, this enduring ministry in the Seattle area, for the way that it proactively reaches out to the least of these, the marginalized, and gives them the message of your love. Bless our time together this morning. In Christ's name, amen.
Amen. It's so good to see you all. My name is Josh Cuellar, if I haven't met you yet. And we've been coming to Advent for, I didn't even look at it, Sarah, 2 years. Yeah, 2 years now, and really enjoyed it and found home here. We came from New Mexico, so out of state. So this is kind of going to be a little bit of an abbreviated version of a lot of the trainings we do for the community, and they're called HOPE. And as you can imagine, that's with reason, it's intentionality. Hope is often lost and hard to foster for those being trafficked. So I know we're a little bit of a smaller group right now, but if you ever have heard of sex trafficking, if you have been personally impacted by sex trafficking, or you know someone who is vulnerable to being involved in sex trafficking, you can raise your hand real quick. And the reason we do that is because this can be a difficult topic to talk about, but it's also a topic that we're all affected by, whether we realize it or not. And so one of the things I like to say is we might not have a personal connection to sex trafficking, but we all, especially as believers, I love talking to other brothers and sisters because it's easy to say that we have a personal responsibility to enact God's justice and bring about his kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. And so we're all coming into this topic with different experiences. We may not have a personal connection, but we all have a personal responsibility. And I always like to acknowledge the difficultness of this topic because it is difficult to talk about. And especially if you or someone you know or love has had a personal experience with trafficking. So with that being said, please feel free. It's not going to hurt my feelings if you need to step outside or do anything to take care of yourself in that moment. As a point of beginning, I just want us to consider God's heart for the vulnerable, the least of these in society. And these are just some of the scripture passages that kind of point to that. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted, and he saves the crushed in spirit. You can look at Matthew 25, where that phrase, the least of these, comes from. Whatever you did for one of these brothers and sisters, you did for me. And then where we get our namesake as an organization, Rest, Matthew 11:28, where Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest." I want us also to, as we begin, consider Charlotte's story. So Charlotte was born in a lower middle class family here in the Puget Sound area, whose parents both worked long hours. And as work pressures began to rise up further and further, she just never felt that deep connection that is so important to feel from the parent to child. She never felt like she was loved by her parents. She struggled to fit in at school, to find that niche, that community that we all need so well. And as she was a teenager, her parents began to use and abuse alcohol to cope with the pressures that they faced as well. And it was not an issue at first, but soon became a problem. And the first time her father hit her, he promised it would be the last. But Charlotte did not wait to find out what would happen next. She left the next morning not really knowing where to go, or where she was going, or who to turn to. And she wasn't gone 42 hours before she was first approached by another young man who invited her to dinner, and he started grooming her. He asked her if she needed a place to stay. She was a little worried about the situation, but she had no other place to turn. And this young man treated her very well for a while. He purchased things for her that she never really had in her life. He would take her on trips to Las Vegas and down in Southern California, even to New York City. He bought her new clothes. He told her that he loved her and that her parents never really did care for her anyways, and he could fill that relational gap. And all was well until one day he invited a friend over, and Charlotte was what's called turned out that day, and she started a life in the sex trade that would persist for the next 5 years. I want you to hold that, because this is called hope, and there's not a lot of hope in that story, but it's not over yet as well. One of the things we really like to do in these presentations is just kind of give some common shared language to describe what we're talking about when we talk about sex trafficking. Because Charlotte's story is unfortunately not unique, and there are estimated upwards of 2,500 individuals in King County alone who are being sold for sex every night. And so that's a huge number, taking only into account King County, and 2,500 men, women, and youth being sold for sex every night.
You said in King County?
Yeah, that number is just King County alone. So that's not looking at, we operate in Snohomish, Pierce, surrounding counties, in the Puget Sound area right now. And so it's a big number. So to answer the question of what is sex trafficking, we're gonna watch this quick video.
She can trust. An adult struggling with addiction who traffics their child for money. An immigrant whose documents are kept until debts are paid off through sex work and an illicit massage business. A young woman's boyfriend who manipulates her into selling her body. Sex trafficking is an exchange of sex for anything of value, such as money, food, and shelter, through the use of force, fraud, or coercion, or when the victim is a minor. Traffickers prey on the vulnerable. Poverty, child abuse, racial disparities, substance use, mental illness, developmental delays, gender and sexual minorities, or simply anyone looking for love or acceptance are all factors that increase a person's vulnerability. And this isn't something that's only happening in other countries. Thousands of people are trafficked in every community around the U.S. every day. Once victims are trafficked, they suffer immensely. One study in the United States says that 86% of women were subjected to physical violence, sexual assault, and other forms of violence while in the sex trade. Traffickers may use violence toward the victim and their loved ones. Abusers alternate between affection and violence to manipulate their victims into thinking they're loved and that it's their choice to stay. Victims find it hard to leave because they think this is love. Shame keeps them stuck and makes it difficult for them to receive help. If they do find the strength to leave, they struggle to find other opportunities. Studies show that over 90% of women engaged in the sex trade would leave if they thought they had another option. Each year, REST opens doors to other opportunities for hundreds of victims and survivors, offering pathways to freedom, safety, and hope. Everyone deserves to be loved. Everyone deserves a life free from exploitation.
So that video was produced by a, I don't know what's coming up now. So that video was produced by a local artist in partnership with REST, talks about experiences common in the sex trade. And so one of the things I want to highlight is what is trafficking, because oftentimes you might have heard in the news times reporting about sex work, and that we need to just have some definitions. So the United States Trafficking Victims Protection Act defines trafficking as including one or more of these themes: an actions, a means, a purpose. So when we're looking at an individual who is involved in the sex trade, meaning is trading something for sex, we're looking for these factors to see if they are involved in trafficking as well, mainly the force, fraud, and coercion. It's important to note that when a person is under the age of 18, when they're a minor, it's always going to be considered trafficking because they're not, of course, able to make those decisions for themselves. And as we'll see, rarely are adults making those decisions for themselves as well. So force, fraud, and coercion. Many people think trafficking involves the smuggling of people, the movement of people from one location to the other, but this definition, this federal definition we're working with, actually doesn't require it. And the majority of clients at Rest were born in the United States, grew up in the United States, and were trafficked in the United States. So one of the things we like to point out at these kinds of awareness of presentations is that trafficking does unfortunately happen here. It's not just an issue overseas. It's not just an issue that we're not affected or touched by in some way. So REST works with anyone who has experienced the sex trade. Oftentimes we find that once someone has had the moment, the rest, for a good word, to kind of take a breath and consider their own situation, even those working seemingly independently without a pimp trafficker relationship, find that there was some force, fraud, or coercion when they first entered the sex trade, or that maybe they were first sold for sex as a minor, which would constitute trafficking as well. So we choose at REST to work with anyone involved in the sex trade.
What is local tracks?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, if there's ever like a word, please feel free to ask a question about. I'll try to define some. Local tracks is the main geographic location where sex is sold, where individuals sell and purchase and traffic sex. So the most notable track in Seattle, of course, is the North Aurora corridor. Probably familiar with that. If you've ever been down on that street, you've seen it very visible. And it's actually one of the most actively upfront tracks in all of the US. With that being said, it still exists all over our neighborhoods and the suburbs. Even out here it exists, and on the east side. There was a large sting operation that took place a couple years ago in Bellevue, Kirkland area, and you may have remembered seeing that story, but yeah, dozens of individuals arrested during that. So we work with anyone involved in the sex trade. 500 of that number I mentioned, around 2,500, are under the age of 18, and we have this really cool youth advocate that her job is to just work with youth, to do street outreach, to meet with them, get them connected to different services and the like as well. So survivors, and even the name survivors you hear me use, oftentimes we won't use victim at REST, even though there is a legal definition that they are victims, right, of some atrocious act of being exploited. We kind of choose survivor because it kind of brings up the individual, kind of empowers them rather than feeling that they are a victim, even though there is some legal connotations to that. And we'll kind of just briefly talk about the three roles that take place in the sex trade: survivors, sex buyers, and sex traffickers. But survivors constitute all ages. We had a woman who was enrolled in services at REST celebrate her 65th birthday with us, which on one hand is incredibly disheartening that she is 65 and still involved in the sex trade, but also like she made it to age 65 while being involved in the sex trade. Yeah, the common statistic cited is that in 7 years, if you're involved in the sex trade for up to 7 years, you will usually die because of drug use because of violence or death by suicide. And so 7 years for 65 years old she was. So it affects all ages. Both men and women are affected. Though we will note a disproportionate amount of women are affected. This is an exploitation that is done by men onto women. All economic classes, races, education levels. We had a individual who she had lived a comfortable, seemingly comfortable middle-class life up until the point where her husband died, and she just didn't have that safety net. And so she was turned out. And so average age of recruitment is 13 years old. And that's where we work with anyone involved in the sex trade, because oftentimes that first encounter of trading something for sex happens when you are a minor. And where it happens to everyone in every community, it is not a happening to everyone equally. And so anyone who has a vulnerability in their lives is at risk of being trafficked. One of our staff at Rest, who is also a survivor, said, "I used to blame myself for being stupid enough to get into the sex industry, but it wasn't until I saw the factors that were outside of my control that made me vulnerable to that I was able to be kind and forgive myself." So these are just some of the factors in an individual's life that makes them more vulnerable. So this is a story of one of our clients. Her parents were addicts, and she was sexually abused by both people inside and outside of her family as she was young. She was also being physically abused, and she began to struggle with her mental health, which led to attempts at suicide. Eventually, her mom could not handle taking care of her and her sister anymore, and she abandoned them at the family courthouse. She was 13 years old. She spent the next 4 years at different residential treatment centers before she was put into a group home. Then one day, when hanging out and walking the streets of the city, her friend introduced her to a man. She was hungry, and the man offered her a sandwich. She took it, and he began to groom her. He made her feel cared for and loved for the first time ever, and she began to feel loyal to him. And if she had had anyone else providing food for her, showing love to her, she probably would not have taken his offer. But if we don't know what love looks like, or don't have our basic needs met, it can be enticing to have both of these met in that trafficking relationship. So, in this graphic, we'll see that it's common for survivors of sex trafficking to become perpetrators themselves. So what often happens is a victim is recruited, as we've seen a couple times in our stories. They're sold the dream. Another phrase is love bombed. Essentially, they're just shown so much care and love, and they're bought things and taken on these trips, and felt like cared for, maybe for the first time in their lives. And then, though, they're turned out, and then it becomes obvious that this wasn't an actual caring relationship. And then a family, pseudo-family, harmful family is formed between those being trafficked and the trafficker. And then emotional and economic dependence happens where they aren't able to have their own money. Oftentimes they don't even see the money that they're making, thus the exploitation, right? But also they're experiencing intense PTSD symptoms from the abuse that is happening to them. But oftentimes it's the trafficker that is helping cope with those symptoms as well. So this emotional dependence gets formed. And as you can imagine, this hopelessness gets to set in after weeks and weeks of this. And then maybe to ease their own burden, oftentimes they're told you have to meet a quota. And if you don't meet that quota, there will be consequences. And so oftentimes to help ease that burden, they may in turn traffic someone else, where the victim becomes the perpetrator.
Josh,
Yeah.
what's the average length of time between the recruitment and when they're turned out?
Yeah, it's a great question. The average time depends on the individual, and there is all of this is kind of happening at once too. So like the emotional dependence, the love bombing, the selling the dream, more people who are vulnerable and susceptible to that because of the vulnerabilities, it might take less time, but it just depends. The story I shared beforehand, 42 hours is common for runaway youth to then like meet someone who may traffic them. Yeah, so
Well, that's the time between runaway and recruitment.
yeah,
42 hours. Wow.
yeah. And so runaway youth, foster care, anytime a child is, it's unfortunately, but like easy to lose track of, right? If your kid is going to school and they have, you know, people checking in on them, it's a lot easier to see that earlier on, but yeah. As I mentioned, people involved in the sex trade experience an abundance of trauma. Survivors face trauma at a higher rate than even Vietnam War veterans. Almost double, 67% of those involved in the sex trade are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. That's not to disparage the service of our Vietnam War veterans, but just to highlight the uniqueness of this issue. And these symptoms, of course, are intelligent ways that our bodies have kept us safe. They're survival skills often. But we need to continue to help individuals work through them. So any anti-trafficking efforts and what we do at REST needs to address these trauma symptoms as well. One of the things I'm kind of passionate about, because I'm a church guy, I don't know if you knew this, but before I started working with REST back in New Mexico, I was a pastor at a church, associate pastor, and I just love the local church. And so one of the things that I'm passionate about is helping churches become places of welcome for survivors. And that's a uniqueness when we consider what trauma they've experienced and how that may play. It's maybe a discussion for another time. But any other questions right now? Again, this is heavy. I know it's heavy. It's early on a Sunday morning. Thank you for being here and taking the time. Yeah.
So are there certain things that a person would look for to recognize someone who's involved in the sex trade?
Yeah, that's a great question. So typically you look for things that just don't make sense. And depending on your profession, if you're asking questions in healthcare or a teacher or something like that, and you're there with an adult or someone else, and the individual is not allowed to answer for themselves, they have to account for where they are every time. Nowadays, if they don't have a cell phone, it might be an indication, might not. You want to look for things that don't make sense to the socioeconomic status of the person. If they had been dressed like this and then the next day dressed really nice or provocative, that might be indication that that kind of emotional and economic dependence is happening. For children, use of language around sexuality that doesn't match their developmental stage. They are knowing things in terms, acts that just doesn't make sense. Yeah, those types of things. And then of course, the vulnerabilities in someone's life. But yeah, good question.
You know, with the average age being 13, are the schools doing anything?
Yeah, there are some efforts. One of the things we would love to do is to like get into schools and do this presentation, this kind of awareness presentation, even for students at an age appropriate, developmental appropriate level, you know. There are things we can do there, but yeah, ways to partner with schools is really important.
Are you gonna talk more about your organization?
Yeah, definitely.
A ton of questions.
No, yeah.
I'll be patient.
No worries.
Okay.
We'll kind of move on quickly. Talk about the pimps, traffickers. They're essentially entrepreneurs, business owners. The commercial sexual exploitation, the sex trade at its root is a business. And it's a business that exploits individuals, but there's a supply and demand, and these individuals see a means of earning money by selling people. But they also play the role of romantic, intimate partners. It could be, we see familial trafficking happening, we see organized crime happening, and it could be peers, as we mentioned before. There's of course no evidence that traffickers are likely to be of any particular race, nationality, gender, or sexual orientation. The Bureau of Justice Statistics, surveying 2,000 defendants charged with sex trafficking, saw that 77% of them were men and 58% of them were Black. And the reasons behind that were probably because African American men were the ones doing the street trafficking, where men of other colors and races were doing more the organized crime piece, more behind the scenes, less easy to arrest and then get into the justice system that way. But they, every person. Couple things to note about traffickers. They often speak of the profitability of trafficking human beings over something like drugs or even arms, which are the other highest illegal trafficking businesses. Although human trafficking, which would include labor trafficking and sex trafficking, is the fastest growing illegal business in America. And so there's this mentality among traffickers that you can only sell a drug once, but you can unfortunately sell a person over and over again. And so one of the things we also like to highlight, and which is really a heartbeat when we talk about rest, is that everyone is deserving of love. Everyone needs to be loved. And this is true, of course, of survivors and victims, which is the most obvious for us, but this is also true of traffickers. And so when we look at a statistic of 4 out of 5 street traffickers were once victims themselves, that kind of helps us feel compassion even for traffickers. And also important to note, that does not exclude justice from being done. In fact, justice is a loving thing, but just a realization that oftentimes traffickers themselves were trafficked and exploited. This quote is a quote that's often said on the street: you either pimp or you get pimped. So whatever background the traffickers come from, they all use power and control to maintain their business. And that can look a lot of different ways. Here are some of them. The point being, though, that you want to create a dependency in that harmful relationship so that it becomes really difficult for them to escape and find something else. Briefly, we'll talk about sex buyers as well. Average age is 38 years old, with the first purchase of sex being at 21. It's important to highlight, and maybe even important for me to highlight as a man, that 99% of sex buyers are men. So if we're talking about Indian sex trafficking, one of the things we have to do is, as men, and I know not talking specifically to us in here, but maybe people we know, stop buying sex. That's going to be the theme that will end sex trafficking. If 99% of sex buyers are men, we need men to stop buying sex, which means a whole lot of other things, right? We need men of character, we need men who follow Jesus, all these other things. But essentially, that would, in business terms, and I'm going to speak out of what I actually know, but you drive the demand, the supply will go away, right? So the majority of buyers earn more than $100,000 a year and pay more than $100 per transaction. This one at the bottom, 1 in 5 men, is important to highlight. 1 in 5 men who have never bought sex previously could envision buying sex in the future if the circumstances were right. The peak time for procuring sex, for purchasing sex, is 2 p.m. on a weekday. And so if you're unfamiliar with what's going on at 2 p.m. on a weekday, most of the time we're at our jobs in businesses. And so one of the things we like to highlight is if you're a business owner, if you manage people, if you supervise people, is to maybe even formally create a policy that says you are not allowed to purchase sex on company property with company property. And then that would help curb that. One of our partner organizations, BEST, Businesses Ending Sex Trafficking, works with businesses and business owners to do just that, to educate on that. Here's some demographics about sex buyers from King County. Runs the gamut of profession and background. Includes IT, construction, business services. As we think about this question and how do we end sex trafficking, we need to consider, why do men even purchase sex in the first place? This is not an exhaustive list. And of course, as believers, the root cause is in a desire to honor self and gratify self above God. But we're discouraged and dissuaged from showing a full range of emotion oftentimes, but instead expected to be angry, in control, and to explore our sexuality. There's a history of the sex trade through colonialism and slavery as well. And then the current acceptance and propagation of pornography is huge. It trains us to look at individuals created in the image of God, not as that, but as products to consume, to gratify self. And so any of these efforts have to address these as well. So, want to revisit Charlotte's story, because as I said, it doesn't end there, actually. There is hope for everyone. We believe in a resurrected Jesus who died 3 days later, and he got up on the third day. And so that means that there's hope for everyone. So reconsider Charlotte's story with me for a second. She showed immense courage and fortitude when she first came to talk to REST's outreach team. We do street outreach. One of the things we do is, in the past, we've handed out highlighters that have had our hotline number, and so folks can take that and it has our number on it. And she grabbed one of those one time and took down the number and promised to call someday. When she did call REST, she was able to stay in our shelter for a while, where she received mental health services, met with our advocates. And after several weeks of meeting and praying with our advocates, Charlotte decided she wanted to pursue a job in real estate. The advocate was then able to connect her with another community member, a volunteer who was able to help her with some job readiness skills. If you've never had a formalized job, things like an interview, developing a resume, what do you wear to an interview, what do you say, when someone asks you what your weaknesses are, what do you say? Like, you can help me out with that one because I don't even know that one. But so job readiness skills. And she was able to then continue on her journey and pursue her real estate license. So she has a long way to go, but because of that intervention, she was able to redirect her life. Let me talk about REST for the rest of our time here. Our mission is to expand pathways of freedom, safety, and hope to end sex trafficking.
Josh, can you say, is there an increase of sexual trafficking now, say compared to the last 50 years? Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? Is it just becoming more obvious or more publicized? What's that look like?
Yeah, it's getting worse. Though our efforts to do something about it are becoming more and better equipped, I'd say. I mentioned earlier that REST, when we started 15 years ago, was the only organization of its kind doing this work in Seattle. And so trafficking still existed, there just weren't services or awareness or community buy-in to end it. Now there's 16 organizations like REST doing work in Seattle alone, and many more if you were to expand that to kind of international work as well. So I think where it's getting worse. And more recently, during like COVID lockdowns, a time you would think that would kind of stop. It did for a little bit, and we saw a decrease in trafficking victims and survivors. But quickly, as people, whatever the pressures, lost jobs, and etc., it actually increased. And so since then, we've seen a slight increase in trafficking.
So where do you get your statistic? Is that arrests come, is it the police that are reporting the number of arrests, or where are those statistics coming from?
That one in particular is REST clients, so those engaged in services with REST in some way. We do get statistics from, the county, city of Seattle, law enforcement. Those being engaged with law enforcement, things like that. So we provide survivor-centered services in the greater Seattle area. We were considering, though, that that's not just enough for us to serve those in Seattle, and God has given us this wealth of information and knowledge and just that we've gained over the years, that we want to help others. And so we launched a training and partnerships arm this year to provide service nationwide and kind of help multiply our impact across the country. So I get the privilege of kind of doing a little bit of that as well, and doing some of our trainings online for direct service professionals and for community members as well. And we're looking to develop strategic partners between survivors and change makers in our community. So here's a little glimpse of our continuum of care that really seeks to meet a survivor wherever they may be, through outreach, our hotline, and all of this you see. This is a unique thing that REST does, the only one of its kind in the state of Washington, which we're really proud of. And it's important to have this kind of wraparound care, as you can imagine, because it's not, their survivor's journey is not linear, as much of us are, right? If you were to decide to change something, change an eating habit, or maybe you just wanted to read more this year, like me, and you're like, okay, I'm gonna read more. Well, there might be a day you do and a day you don't. There might be a week you do and a week you don't. And it's a lot of loop-de-loops and back and forth. And so this helps kind of just come around survivors wherever they are to support them.
Josh, what's it, survivor reaches out to you guys and goes to one of your houses, like, what does it look like before, they get out and they're on their own? Like, what's the track look like?
Yeah, so oftentimes survivors are entered into services at REST through our outreach. Street outreach looks like just going on the track on Aurora. We have street outreach happening in Pioneer Square in Seattle, Minnesota as well. And just going and making connections, just asking good questions and listening. And then oftentimes the easiest referral is to our hotline, and then people can call the hotline and be connected to services within REST or without. And then so typically someone comes in through those means. Also word of mouth, it just kind of spreads. You're talking to one of your peers and you're like, hey, I would really like help finding a job. And they're like, oh, you have to go see the advocates at REST. And then that's another entry. And then we're trying to address those vulnerabilities we talked about earlier. So one of the biggest ones is housing, and then it's jobs, and having another mean of income where you can, purchase your own place to stay, purchase your own food, and make a living apart from the sex trade. If you're making, again, might not see all of that money, but if one transaction is $100, it's hard to make up that income at a minimum wage job. Though we are, trying to obviously see, for us, we understand that it's so much better to, even if you weren't able to have that same lifestyle, to be out of the sex trade and out of that exploitative relationship. So they may come in, they may stay at our shelter, they're able to stay for 90 days in the shelter. They have their own individual room. This one is just for women as well, this service, which is really important if you're being exploited and you go to, there's a lot of really good work happening around homeless ministries and different things going on. Oftentimes they're not equipped to help this particular population with their traumas. And so like, if you go in and you're placed in a dormitory style room, it's very difficult to have a survivor in a room with a bunch of different people, even if they're all women, you know. So they have individual rooms in the shelter, they can stay up to 90 days. We're working in transitional housing with Transition in Place, which is subsidized rental assistance, if you're unaware. And the goal is to get into permanent housing in some way. A lot of our volunteers and some of our staff even are survivors themselves. And so we really have this vision of not just getting to this point where it's the basic needs are being met, you have housing, you have a job, but for those that God would call and kind of lead this direction, to do the work yourself, and whether that's working directly with other survivors in a peer-to-peer way, with REST or another organization, or advocating for legislation change, or doing presentations for awareness. We want survivors kind of leading out on that as well. Here's some numbers. If you're a number person, it'll probably be helpful. One thing I want to call out though is 643 individuals engaged with REST, which is awesome. That makes us one of the biggest organizations of its kind in the country to have that many people engaged.
Is that just King County, or is that larger than, is that the state? What area? You know, how large of a group are you talking about?
Yeah, we have clients kind of all over the area. So not just King County, but surrounding counties. We have, especially with our advocates, they're like a little bit more mobile to go meet with someone. So where our shelter is in Seattle, our advocates are able to come up to Snohomish, or, you know,
Is REST in other cities too, or is it just here?
We're just in the Seattle area, but one of the ways we're trying to kind of expand that is through the training. And so rather than taking kind of a like a chain restaurant model where we'll just kind of come along and say like, hey, you're doing really great work. You're a little bit newer, like a little younger than REST is, and how can we help come alongside you and support you? And one of the trainings we had this year, so we really launched that this year. We were able to do to train people from New York City, from Las Vegas, from Houston, from other parts of the country, but there were also a group from Albania that joined us, which was really cool. That was our first like international interaction that way. So yeah.
How many paid employees in your organization?
Yeah, it varies a lot. There's a lot of burnout and turnover with all nonprofits and churches, and but I think particularly with REST, there's a lot of turnover. We have 35 when we're fully staffed. I think we're a little closer to 30 right now with some gaps. If you know a major gifts officer that wants to And as we kind of wrap up our time, I want to give you some handles you can walk away with. What can we do now? We got to address the vulnerabilities we talked about, those things that can hinder the demand for trafficking. Got to be addressed. The more folks have their needs met, the less likely they are to turn to the sex trade to have those needs met, simply put. One of the things you can do is raise awareness. Being here today, you're raising your own awareness about this issue and what it is. Bring others along with you. We do these types of awareness presentations for businesses, corporations, schools, anything. But there's also these ways, of course, you can help. I'll highlight that not everyone is meant or should donate, but if you're feeling led to above and beyond what you give to Advent, you can donate. It takes funds, of course, to do all of our services. But even more than that, like partnering with us in a way that is meaningful in volunteering, in helping raise awareness yourself. There's a lot of ways you can do that. I kind of am in charge of the volunteers as well, so that's easy for our parish to get connected to volunteerism. One other thing I'll mention is our gala. If you're interested in kind of hearing more, we're going to have survivors speak. We're going to have a survivor art show, which will be really cool. It's coming up next month. Wow, it's September. Yeah, next month on October 17th. And yeah, I'll just invite everyone. Mostly because I'd like to hang out with you. But yeah, that's kind of all I have. Are there any other questions? Got a few more minutes. Any other questions unanswered? Yeah.
Okay, I guess my first question, working in a shelter in Everett, not a sex trafficking shelter, just a homeless shelter. We have the problem of like running out of beds, running out of shelters, running out of housing. Do you guys experience that as well? Is there ever a time when someone would call you and you would say, sorry, we're full?
Yes, we're always full up in our shelter and in our transitional housing. There's usually a waiting list as well. That's, as you all are aware, one of the greatest needs in our area.
Okay.
What's
And
your
then,
capacity there?
Yeah, so in the shelter we have 8 beds, 8 rooms. In the houses we have a total of 11 beds. So it's not a lot when you consider the need, right? And we would love to do more. I'm just unable to at this time.
So, I'm sort of back to the initial questions, how to recognize people. So, for instance, we have the food bank downstairs. So when people come in, we have people coming in all the time, some of which we'll never see again, some we'll see it, we will see. What do we, how would we keep our eyes open? And you said something about initial questions. So what are those initial questions?
It's a great question, thank you. Yeah, I think it's important, to be on the lookout if we're talking about vulnerabilities that make someone at risk, food insecurity, right? So one of the questions, when it's appropriate, and I think it would be appropriate in your case, you could say something as simple as like, you describe what the sex trade is. So oftentimes people will trade sex for a place to stay or something to eat, a place to shower. Has that ever been your experience? And then kind of just inviting them to consider their own situation. I will note, oftentimes people who are being trafficked don't acknowledge that it's a trafficking relationship.
Right.
They're like, yeah, I spend a lot of time with my boyfriend or my family, whatever. Yeah.
Now, the other question is tied to that as well. We have an information board where we hand out information. So what kind of information would we want to put to be able to get that information in the right hands?
Yeah, I would love to send you something. We have, I think the hotline is the best
Okay.
mode.
Okay.
Folks can call it, not in crises either.
Right.
People can call us, they just had a good day and they want to celebrate with someone, but they don't know who to call. And so it's helpful to just kind of get that out. But even some information, we have some flyers and stuff of what is trafficking, it happens here, what does it look like?
You said, what would volunteers be doing? If you what kind of volunteers do you need?
Yeah, so we do have a website, iwantrest.com,
Oh,
for more information. You can come grab some, if any of this is helpful. Need a beanie, go grab a beanie. So volunteers are doing everything. The services we talked about, they're supporting our staff there. We have volunteers doing outreach. So that's kind of the more front facing, but we also have some background volunteers as well, helping with events, helping with IT stuff. Those job readiness seminars I mentioned, we have volunteers kind of facilitate those workshops sometimes. Mentorship sometimes is really important, just kind of connections. And one of the things I'm interested in starting is kind of some prayer partnerships, if that kind of seems interesting to anyone. And then I think we talked about some hygiene kits as well. So hygiene kits are used in outreach, and so assembling those kits would